The Brock House Indigenous Studies has been going for several years. It has been our intent to contribute to reconciliation by educating ourselves on the topic and engaging with others with the same intentions. To this end, we are also introducing speakers in these special pop-up events with whom we intend to reach a wider audience among our members. It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Cole Harris, who for years has been a student of immigrant societies in early Canada and of their relations with Indigenous peoples. He is the editor of the first volume of the Historical Atlas of Canada, 1987, and the author, among other works, of Making Native Space, Colonialism, Resistance, and Reserves in British Columbia, 2002, and The Reluctant Land, Society, Space, and Environment in Canada Before Confederation, 2008. And the subject of today's presentation, Abounded Land, Reflections on Settler Colonialism in Canada. He's the winner of many academic awards. He's also a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and an officer of the Order of Canada. He is a professor emeritus of historical geography at the University of British Columbia. It is with great pleasure that I invite you to join us. Thank you, Dr. Harris.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks for the invitation to speak to you all. I've spoken several times to Brock House over the years, and I've thoroughly enjoyed doing so. Now, the circumstances have changed a little bit this time. I'm not really used to this electronic age. You're really being talked to by electronically speaking, by a fossil. So we'll see how it goes. I'm used to talking to live bodies rather than to faces, interesting as those faces are. Anyway, here we are. I should say that I've had preliminary discussions with Glenys Ackland about this. And I did say early on when she asked me to give a lecture on my book, Abounded Land, I said, you know, Glenys, this is really a summary of my more conceptual and, in a loose sense, more theorized thought about Canadian settler society and its relations with Indigenous people. My thought over the last 50 years or so, and it's rather difficult to summarize it in one lecture. And Glenys immediately said, well, you can have 2 lectures. And so I thought, gosh, I've been hoisted on my own petard there. There was nothing I could do at that point, so I had to agree. So you have to put up with me twice. I'm speaking 2 weeks hence, and 2 weeks hence, I will talk about British Columbia, and I will try and say a little bit about the particular nature of this settler colonial society, this immigrant society, which I think in so many ways is unlike the immigrant settler societies that have preceded it in Eastern Canada, in Eastern North America. But today I'm really going to take up the title of my book, Abounded Land. Abounded Land. What do I mean by that? What am I talking about, this bounded land? And what are the implications of boundedness for our fascinating, but rather peculiar and rather difficult to understand country? So with that as the briefest of introductions, let me ask Lee to put on the first of the maps. Wonderful. Now this, I think, is one of the most remarkable maps you could ever hope to see about Canada. This is the distribution of population in Canada, where the density has reached at least 1 person per square mile. That's not very many people, 1 person per square mile. And this is at the time of Confederation. This is 1870, the census of 1871. And what you see, what it shows is settlement in southern Ontario, settlement along the St. Lawrence corridor, and patchy settlement in the Maritimes. It exaggerates the settlement to the west. It shows the Red River settlement is much more substantial, and it was. There were only 12,000 people there. And it picks up the beginnings of settlement at the gold camps in the interior of British Columbia. But basically, it shows a tiny segment of what had become British North America occupied by the settlers. And this is in 1871. This is more than 350 years after John Cabot came to Newfoundland and discovered the abundance of fisheries there. It's more than 300 years after Jacques Cartier sailed up the St. Lawrence and tried to settle. After his description of the north shore of the Gulf of St. Lawrence as the land that God gave as his portion to Cain. He thought he'd seen not one cartload of earth there, and he was right, there wasn't. In short, the European penetration of Canada, which was by and large a penetration of an agricultural civilization, of people who were looking for agricultural land in terms that European people could understand, found a very meager opportunity. And the reason why it was so meager, of course, was that to the north of this little patch of black land was the rim of the Canadian Shield. Granite, rock, exceedingly short growing seasons, endless summer black flies, most uninviting terrain, not feasible agricultural land. And then the southern boundary was, of course, a political boundary. And it had been set by the events surrounding the 7 Years' War and the fall of the French position in North America, and by the American Revolution. In the wake of these cataclysmic events, 1755 to 1763, and then the American Revolution, comes the border across eastern North America between what remains of British North America and the new United States. So it's in this limited space between rock to the north and an international border to the south that settler Canada emerges. Now let me have the second map, please. This is a map of the United States at the same date. In this case, it's 2 people per square mile. And you see the extraordinary difference. Look at it. There's a little bit of unsettled land in southern Florida. There's a little bit of unsettled land, the Adirondacks in northern New York State, a little bit of unsettled land in northern Maine, but elsewhere, the whole swath of eastern United States, from the Atlantic to well beyond the Mississippi, and from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes, is settled. Once the Americans got across the Appalachians, which they could do, the Appalachians were penetrable, were traversable in the way the Canadian Shield was not. Once they had got through, they're in some of the richest agricultural land anywhere in the world. And as they got rid of the Indians, either by killing them off or by relocating them, which in one way or another they largely did, there was this huge landed bounty awaiting the United States. So what I'm suggesting is that the landed experiences of our country and of the United States were fundamentally different. One aside with penury, with boundedness, with parsimony, and the other with abundance, with generosity, with plenitude. So it's the implications of this that I want to try and play around with a bit today. Could we just go quickly back to that first map, please? No, the first. There we are, yes. Now, these little patches of dark land are where settler colonialism begins in Canada. These become settler colonies. The first 2 of them are French, of course. There's in the Bay of Fundy, there is the Acadian colony, it's tiny and weak colony, Acadia, and along the lower St. Lawrence, Canada, much more substantial, far more immigration, substantial towns emerging in Quebec and Montreal, and eventually a fairly abundantly settled countryside. And then later, of course, as British settlement pours in, as it does in the early 19th century, and a certain amount from the United States, then there's an expansion of settler colonies. And so you end up with Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. Each of them is settler colony. That is, with a government, with and with settlers, and then Lower and Upper Canada, Canada East, and Canada West. These are settler colonies. And by settler colonies, I mean, of course, that type of colony that is dominated essentially by immigration and the settlement of newcomers, as opposed to administrative colonies, where a small ruling elite controls a territory with the aid of the military. And then when you take that elite away and take away the military, well, the prior population reasserts itself. It's always been there, and it comes back to control its space. But in settler colonies, that's not the case. Newcomers have come, they've settled down, they've made this place their home, and when an administrative elite is removed, when its military props are removed, those settlers are still there, and they're in control, and the place has become their home. So what I want to do now is just say a little bit about these early settler societies. And I want to make, I guess, essentially only 3 points about them. The first is that when people move from one location to another, it's virtually impossible for life to remain as it was. So movement entails social and cultural change. Life is going to come out somewhat differently. It's very easy to say that, but it's not so easy to point to the particular nature of change. What is happening? How is life evolving and differentiating itself from its transatlantic progenitors in these New World circumstances? Well, let me say these things about all of these settler colonies. The towns in them tended to reproduce, more than any other parts of these colonies, tended to reproduce European ways. The towns were foci of the power complexes, whether they were military, whether they were administrative, whether they were commercial, whether they were ecclesiastical, that had accompanied settlers. And those power complexes drew social formations in their train. They were not exact reproductions of European towns, but they were fairly close approximations. Montcalm, towards the end of the French regime, Governor Montcalm, he thought that Quebec was as fine as any town in France after the first 10. He was comfortable in Quebec City. He was within a transplanted French town, as he saw. But if you get into the countrysides of these colonies, all of them, the situation is quite different. And in what basic ways? Well, fundamentally, I think the ratio between the value of land and the value of labor had been fundamentally transformed. Suddenly land was, compared to European land costs, was dirt cheap. And labor, because there were relatively few settlers initially, labor was relatively expensive. The pressure of people on land, the intense pressure of people on land, which was characteristic everywhere in Western Europe in the 17th and 18th, and on into, goodness knows, on into the 19th centuries, was not the case here. And so the relative availability of land was opportunity for the poor. And the relative cheapness of land was disincentive for the wealthy. And so all that hierarchy of power in Europe that rested on really the ability to control scarce land was weakened in these settings. I don't want to suggest that these were egalitarian societies. They weren't. There's a social range within them, of course. but they are, compared to the European societies out of which these people have come, the social hierarchy had been considerably compressed. On the other hand, for ordinary people, there is opportunity. There's an essay in this book on early Acadia, and it's there partly because my studies of settler colonialism began with Acadia, but also because Acadia is a relatively simple colony. There were only 300 immigrants. They'd become 10,000 by the time they were deported in 1755. And it's fairly easy to get a hold of Acadia and understand its basic structure. And what there was there was essentially was a remarkable opportunity for peasantry. People could get along. They could, once they got the marshes diked, they could produce livelihoods for ordinary people, and they did. And so the marriage age drops, the number of children per family rises, the survival rate of children by any measure compared to the French peasantry at the time, these people are better off. They're not wealthy, but they're getting along and they're reproducing themselves, and the population is growing very rapidly. And so what you get is a relatively undifferentiated population of small peasant farmers. And in a way, I mean, that's right at one of the extremes, but that is going on broadly. And so that vast burden of wealth and power that sat so heavily on the working people, on the peasantry of Western Europe, is weakened in these settings, and that's a fundamental change in the sort of the vertical social structure of these societies. And the other basic change that is taking place is that Europe at this time is a dense tapestry of local ways, a complex patchwork of regional cultures where people spoke, if they're still speaking French, or there was French speakers or English speakers, speaking English or French with different accents, dressing somewhat differently, building houses somewhat differently, practicing different folk ways, using different tools, laughing at different types of jokes, viewing outsiders as strangers, not quite to be trusted. You didn't have to travel very far. You didn't have to travel very far in that Europe, where overland transportation was slow and expensive and often quite dangerous, and where the state is exerting very little normalizing influence on the countryside to get into different local ways. And one of the things that migration does is break this apart too, because people are not coming as groups out of the same place. They're coming from here and they're coming from there, and these different backgrounds are mixing. And so you get not only a change in the vertical organization of European society, but also in the horizontal, the spatial organization of European society. So what I'm saying is that the matter of moving people from one place to another is not a simple matter of transfer. It's also a matter of cultural change. And that there really is a creative process going on here, where somewhat different societies are being created. Acadia, just before the Acadians are deported, is a society of small farmers who still speak French, but they don't speak French the way any French people quite did. They have innumerable ways that are derived from France, but they haven't put them together in quite the ways that any French people did. They are a distinctive peasantry tucked away in a corner of the North Atlantic. And so it is in all of these patches that a process of cultural change is going on. And somewhat different lives, different ways of being in the world are still drawing heavily on Europe, of course, but no longer quite European in many basic ways, are being forged. So that's one thing I want to say about these places. There's a new ways of life being worked out in them. But the other thing I want to point out, or another thing I want to point out, is that, of course, the space is limited. And these are predominantly agricultural societies. They depend on the expansion of family farms. And where, after a time, is that expansion going to go? where are people going to be put? In the United States, where you've got that huge swath of land, there's an immense room for westward expansion. But where is the westward expansion here? There isn't. There can't be. You run into the Great Lakes, you run into rock. There are attempts to move northward. There's a curé in Quebec, Curé Labelle, who argues that the whole northern swath of British North America can be the home of the French-Canadian nation. But he was wrong. It couldn't. The Minister of Agriculture in Ontario thought that the Huron Tract, which is the land between Georgian Bay and the Ottawa Valley, could support 8 million people. He was wrong. It couldn't. So where are people going to go? Well, there's one of the essays in the book deals with the French settlement, French-Canadian settlement of a seigneury up the Ottawa Valley, Petit Nation. It had been Louis-Joseph Papillon's seigneury. And what is a picture of is of people moving into the edge of the Canadian Shield at a time when the lumbering is getting going, when the rock and cold of the Canadian Shield hardly supports agriculture, when there are too many people searching too few jobs, and so the wages in the forest industry are abysmally low. Conditions in Petit Nation are horrible. People are virtually starving. Desperate struggle for survival at the edge of the Canadian Shield. That's what happens when people try to go into this north. The more usual pattern was to go south. And all of these patches of land are draining people southward into the United States, from the Maritimes into the Boston States, from Quebec into the factory towns of New England, from Ontario into a huge crescent of land, westward into the continental interior of the United States. What this means is this southward migration of people is pushing people into American melting pots and is maintaining the difference between different patches of British North American settlement. So after a while, there's no more room for immigrants in these patches, and the young are leaving but are not going to adjacent patches, they're going south. So what you get is a sharp cultural regionalization taking place, where these patches are really quite differentiated from each other. And you have a basis not for the creation of a homogeneous melting pot, but for the perpetuation of difference, of variety. That's important too, and I'll come back to that. I've got to watch it. The trouble with this is that I get talking and talk too long, and I mean, you got to stop me. Anyway, I'll go on, and we've got to be careful here. We'll run out of time. But anyway, the other thing I want to say, of course, is that this land the settlement is taking place on Indigenous land. Indigenous people are here before. The English theorist of settler colonialism, Herman Merivale, argued in the late 1830s, giving a set of lectures at Oxford, that the interests of settlers and Indigenous people were fundamentally opposed. He said they both wanted the same land. He was right about that. It had been Indigenous land. Settlers wanted, I mean, the whole purpose of being there as a settler was to get a hold of this land. It was the basis of one's settler life, of settler prosperity. So there's that fundamental tension. He said that that if land was conceded in reserves for Native people, settlers would want it, and they would demand that these reserves be reduced in size. He was right about that. And he said that settlers would demand responsible government, and that eventually it would be granted. That is, power would shift from the Crown and from the Colonial Office to local legislatures, and those legislatures would be dominated by settlers, and with settler interest in the survival and growth and stability of settler societies, and with all settlers' characteristic interests in land. And he was right about that. And so you end up with, here's a petition from a Micmac. He's writing to the Queen, and this is about 1840. And he's laying it on the line. My people are poor, no hunting grounds, no beaver, no otter, no nothing. Indians poor, poor forever, no store, no chest, no clothes. All these woods once ours. Our fathers possessed them all. Now we cannot cut a tree to warm our wigwam in winter unless the white man please. Powerful stuff. I've been through the records of the Indian Reserve Commissions in British Columbia. The chiefs are saying exactly the same thing here over and over and over again, that the reserves they've been conceded were too small in the first place, and they're being reduced, they're pecked away by settlers, and they simply cannot live on the lands they have been given. From a settler's point of view, though, Native people tucked away on reserves are almost invisible. There are not that many of them there, and they're out of sight, they're out of mind, and these settler societies are carrying on in their own momentum. That is one side of Canada in 1871, these settler colonies. That's where the majority of the population lives. But what of the rest of this huge space? What is going on there? Well, there are not very many people there. There are probably not more than, in all of this huge space, 100 to 150,000 people. Of those, there may be 10 or 12,000 Métis at Red River. There are a couple of thousand fur traders, white fur traders. There are a few miners in the interior of British Columbia. But the rest, the overwhelming majority of these people are Indigenous. They are Native people. They still occupy this space. It looks empty on this map, but it's not. There are people there. They're there in very small numbers. The population densities are exceedingly low, but that is occupied land. It's occupied by people who've been involved in the fur trade for by this time, depending on the area, in some places for more than 200 years. And of course, their lives have been changed enormously. They've been incorporated really as a labor force within a system of commercial capital that is reaching into their space. They've acquired new dependencies on tobacco, on alcohol, on firearms, not only to hunt but to protect themselves from their enemies who were similarly armed. They often face radically changed ecologies. The pressures of hunting and of the provisioning of posts have shifted the ecologies of many of the regions in which these people live. And in some cases, the basic food supply on which their traditional societies have relied is no longer, supplies are no longer available. So it's become an increasingly precarious existence within the fur trade in the West. But the basic point is, I think, that these people are still there, that nobody is competing yet with them for their land. The traders want resources, but they do not want land. That there are not yet white settlers out there, that this is still native space. And it is still occupied by people who speak their languages, who know full well who they are, where they've come from, to what group they belong, who still share their stories, and a great many of their traditional ways. And you see, now we're beginning to run into the implications of those two, the Canadian and the American map. You see, over that huge swath of resettled land in the United States, the indigenous people have been very largely pushed aside. They're not there anymore, or they're there in such small numbers as to be virtually inconsequential. But this is not the case here. There's nobody else there. In many parts of this territory, no European has ever yet been. And this is still native territory in which a fur trade has penetrated. So if one looks at Canada at Confederation, what one has is not a overall settler society. There are settler colonies, all right, but they're just a toehold, really, on this space. The larger space of Canada in 1867 is still essentially Indigenous space. Modified Indigenous space, of course, but still Indigenous. And that, it seems to me, we're not so far back in time now, 150 years ago. That is exceedingly important. Now let's go to the third map, please. That's the second map. There we are. This is 1960. And of course, by this time, railways have been built across the country. The prairie have been settled. Some of the valleys in British Columbia are settled. This map shows more settlement in British Columbia than in fact there was. But still, you can see that there's huge expansion from 100 years before. But you can also see, I think, that broadly the pattern of the time of Confederation has been maintained. That there's still a fairly narrow band, irregular band, a set of islands almost of settlement across the southern margins of this country. And then as one moves north, it very quickly fades off, and you get into lands that are very sparsely populated. And again, still, the majority population in these sparsely populated, or apparently in a map like this, unsettled lands, the majority population is Indigenous. So what's going on up there at this time? Well, by 1961, in most cases, the fur trade is on its last legs. Habits of the market have changed. Habits of dress have changed in Europe. The market for furs is a way down. But other sides of European life have moved into this area. One of them is missionaries of various stripes, but the most common throughout much of this territory was a French order, the Oblates of Maria Immaculata, the Oblate order, 19th century order, an order of bitterly opposed to the secular materialism of the 19th century. They wanted to return life to almost medieval conditions of simple folk, living on the land, living off agriculture, living close to the rhythm of the church and the church bell, and dependent, of course, on the wisdom and guidance of the local parish priest. All the missionaries were interested in instilling Christian truths, and they were all interested too in what they called the Christian life. And very often they couldn't tell whether they'd really succeeded in instilling Christian truths. Minds were somewhat inscrutable, but they could watch to see whether Christian lives were being lived. And by Christian lives, they usually meant lives that were tied to the nuclear family, the people who were properly wed in Christian terms. They tended to be suspicious of nomadism, which they thought begot sloth, then begot sin, got people hooking up with the wrong partners at the wrong times. And they wanted to sedentize people and sedentize them close to the church. And to do so, they very often, because they had more settlements than they had priests, they appointed watchmen to watch to see that these Christian ways were being observed. And if they were a bit uneasy about the watchman, they appointed watchmen of the watchmen. And the Anglicans tended to do the same. So all of this, of course, is a huge, huge pressure, puts a huge pressure on traditional native ways. It's going right after some of the fundamental, missionaries were going after some of the fundamental tenets of native life, of native belief. How successful they were is always moot, but they're trying. And some of them are, I mean, they're giving their lives to native people. They're learning indigenous languages. They're translating hymns into this or that indigenous language. They're often going to the defense of native people and their land claims and so on, making the government quite suspicious of the missionaries. But overall, they are powerful agents of change. And the missionary agenda anticipates, of course, the residential school agenda, which again is about change, is about transforming native people from one way of life to another. There's also commercial capital turning into industrial capital in these northern lands. They're outposts, they're mines now. They're logging operations, sawmills, pulp mills. And native people are being employed in these operations. But usually they're being employed at the bottom of the employment scale, largely because they don't come with any of the relevant skills. And so they don't compete well with other workers more trained in the ways of work associated with industrial capital. But they're drawn away from the way of life that was still somewhat still based to a considerable extent on indigenous ways, still had been associated with the fur trade. They're drawn into the work relations, the routine, the hours of work, the worker-boss relationships associated with industrial capital. And for the most part, it's a huge shift. And for the most part, they don't fit very well. They often quit because they can't take this type of work for long, or because they simply have to get out on the land to harvest this or that resource that they always had harvested. From the perspective of management, they tend to become a shiftless and unreliable workforce. But of course, these new industries are themselves unreliable. They depend on the international market and its prices. They depend on a shifting technology. These mines, these pulp mills, these sawmills, they come and they go. And when they go, there's suddenly employment that was there for the time suddenly is gone, and one is left with an unemployed workforce and any number of new social pathologies. So the outside world is coming in, but it's coming in a rather, in a powerful but difficult way for indigenous people. And increasingly, the state is operating in these lands too. The state is beginning to, organize trap lines. It is beginning to it figures that it must supply the services that it provides uniformly to all its citizens. But how can it do that if people are out on the land? The way to do that is to agglomerate them, to draw them into centers where schooling can be provided, where health services can be provided, and so on. And so there is a tendency on the part of the state to draw people away from the land towards government-sponsored settlements and to the nexus of services that the government offered there. So, in short, there's an indigenous population that is still surviving in these areas, but it's being bombarded. It's being bombarded by far more vigorously than in the fur trade years, bombarded by alien ways, and life is becoming, if you add the two to this, the introduction of the residential schools, the fact that children are being, a ship is being sent to the north coast, northwest coast, and children are picked up, sent down to residential schools in Edmonton, say, or in Calgary. There for years, sent back years later. They now speak English. They don't speak their Indigenous language. They're other alien souls. They and their parents don't get along. All of this adds up to a huge adjustment, a difficult adjustment in Native lives. It's a complex, evolving accommodation that isn't working very, very well. But the point I want to make beyond all of this is that Native people are still there. They're still there through this large space. They're still the majority of the population. And however battered they are, culturally and socially battered, however racialized, however marginalized, they're there. They're there. And often nobody else is. Or if others are, they're there for short times, and then they're inclined to leave. So this is what we come to in Canada. And I guess I'm running out of time, but let me just sum up by saying that I think if I were to draw two conclusions from all of this, it would be to say that I think what we're seeing now, far more than we've ever seen before, is Native people speaking back to this country, and speaking back loudly, and speaking back in a great variety of ways, in ways in which basically we have to listen. It comes in all sorts of ways. It comes from huge outpouring of interesting Native literature, of Native painting, of Native political protests of one sort or another, blockades, increasingly astute Native politicians who understand how power works in a modern society and are using it to their advantage. What's happened? Yes, here we are. And we can get back to, we don't need to be on these anymore. And I guess, and most fundamentally perhaps, it turns on the very rapid growth of Indigenous populations. In the North, throughout the North, the tiny populations that had been there historically are being replaced by very rapidly expanding Native populations. The old connection with the land has been largely broken. The land cannot support these numbers. People are living in good part on government assistance. Birth rates are up. The Native population is rapidly approaching 5% of the Canadian population. It is by far the most rapidly growing sector of our population. And of course, the North has a limited capacity to absorb these people. The jobs are few and far between. The land is no longer able to support such numbers. And what is happening is that there's a southward migration of Indigenous people into the towns of southern Canada. It's happening across the whole span of this country, and it will continue to happen. And so there are, I think, 100,000 Indigenous people living in Winnipeg. The population of Indigenous people in St. John's is shooting up. And so it goes. And there's no reason for this to stop. There's just this constant drain southward of an expanding Indigenous population moving into southern Canada. We are going to become a somewhat different country. And the other thing I would say in relation to this is that if one looks back to that early Canada, and that had produced these somewhat different cultures, somewhat different societies in different places in Canada, that when the Fathers of Confederation had to come up with a constitution for this country, they of course had to deal with that reality. They had to deal with what was out there. And the British North America Act is not a deductive a priori sort of document. It grows out of the land of this country. And it grows out of the fact that there were quite different peoples living in quite different places. That there was this huge difference between the Frenchness of part of this country and the broadly Britishness of the rest of it. But even within British Canada, there were great differences between the Irishness of much of southern Ontario and the Scottishness of Cape Breton Island, and so it went. And the Fathers of Confederation come up with a confederation that is not based, as the American Confederation was, is not, the American Constitution is not based on the notion of individual rights and of liberty and of freedom. It's not. It's based on the idea of a collective, of collectivities, and on the importance of protecting them, on difference and variety, on neighborliness. And so you've got to protect the space for French Canada. You've got to protect the place for the distinctive character of Nova Scotian society. That's a big difference. Now, the difference between individual rights and a collective orientation is, is one of degree. There are collective elements in American life, there are individual elements in Canadian life, of course. But the balance has shifted in this country. And it shifted because in the States, the combination of Enlightenment philosophy, 18th century Enlightenment philosophy, translated through people like Thomas Paine, and on into getting into the American Constitution, coupled with a huge individual opportunity that the American land represented, where over and over again, there's opportunity for individuals to go out into the land, make something of their own lives, their offspring to go on and do the same again a little farther west. It's a huge landed and to a considerable extent individual opportunity. Canada is a different society. And this is related to, I think, the Indigenous question that we face, because Native people are not looking for individual rights. They don't want to protect the individual's right to be free. They want to protect cultures. They want to protect societies. And this is what Canadians have done for really from Confederation on. So look, this is rather a ramble. I find it a bit difficult to talk like this when I'm not actually talking to people, but sort of talking to myself or talking to a map or talking to a wall. And so I tend to ramble, and I don't quite feel as if I'm always in touch with you people as much as I should be. But anyway, there's a start. There's a few thoughts. You'll get them in a much more digested and coherent form if you're brave enough to actually read some parts of this book of mine. But this will perhaps give you some sense of what's in there. And there is a body of, for better, for worse, there is my thinking about what really this country, this is not an easy country to understand. It's not, because it's so sprawled, it's so scattered, it's composed of such diverse peoples. It takes some getting a hold of it. It's my attempts to make some sense of it are in this book for what they are worth. But look, I've talked too long and I've been rambling a bit too much, but I'll stop there, and if there are questions, go ahead.
Are there any questions?
Sorry, I didn't hear any of that.
I just asked if there were any questions. Here's one. I don't know.
I have a question.
Okay.
I volunteer helping newcomers in Vancouver improve their English language skills. We have a weekly conversation circle, and very frequently the people who are in my groups ask for how to understand Indigenous cultures better. And I'm always looking for resources, either videos or books that are written in simpler language but are appropriate for adults to help introduce them to what is a fascinating topic for them. So far, I haven't found anything that isn't pitched at an extremely childish level, and I wonder if you have come across anything in your experience.
Gosh, that's an exceedingly important matter, to be able to respond well to people asking that question of you. Mm-hmm. All right.
These are people from China, from Japan, from Brazil, from Portugal, from South Korea, and they're deeply interested. And
I'm not a student of Indigenous people. I'm a student of settler societies, and I've studied the impact of these societies on Indigenous peoples. Mm-hmm. And I'm not as much help to you as I should be. Part of the problem is, of course, is that there's so many different Indigenous peoples, and they're quite different. They're quite different from each other. There were 7 major language groups in British Columbia alone. There were 35 different languages spoken in British Columbia, but 7 major language groups. And some of those languages are as different from each other as, say, English is from Chinese. Mm-hmm. So I mean, there are some generalizations one can offer about Indigenous livelihoods and lifeways. I mean, I think the common observation about the sense, well, all my relations, the sense of the interdependence of everything, that everything is tied to everything else. I think most Native groups would subscribe to that view. I think most Native groups had an extraordinarily intimate knowledge of their own local territories. They knew the local flora and fauna the way nobody else subsequently has. And it's amazing the depth. It's becoming, the ethnobotanists have done some wonderful work over the last couple of decades to reveal just the extraordinary depth that Native women had, of the depth of knowledge in Native women of local plant communities and how to prepare plants and the various medical and nutritional and ceremonial uses of plants. And so there are some generalizations, but one also gets into the, this cultural variety. I'll think about that, but off the top, I'm not as helpful as I should be to you. I don't know whether, do you go out to the Museum of Anthropology? And
that's an excellent idea. Yeah.
It's a wonderful place, and there'll be people there who would answer that question better than I. And
that's a great idea.
I would just go and talk to them.
Yeah.
See where they take you.
Yeah.
But it's, I mean, what you're doing is important work, and it deserves a better answer than I can give you.
No, thank you. That's very helpful.
Are there any other questions?
I'd like I've just been beginning to read your book, and right in the very beginning, when you talk about the early settlements along the St. Lawrence, you talk about some immigration from New England and the Quakers, and also just contact with the Algonquins and Mississaugas, which is, I just wonder if you could comment a bit more on that.
Well, the early immigration along the St. Lawrence was French, and it would remain French until after 1760. And it was drawn from quite a broad swath of Western France, from the far north almost down to Bordeaux. But you're talking about a later migration. Certainly, I mean, after the American Revolution, there is a migration into Quebec, beginning of migration into Upper Canada and into the Maritimes. That is partly, I mean, some of it is the Loyalist migration, and some of it is just American land seekers, who are sort of the northern edge of this vast westward movement that I've been briefly describing, American westward movement. And it does pick up some Quakers, among others, and various Universalists and Unitarians and Baptists, and but it gets submerged in a much larger migration coming out of the huge transformation that industrialization is working in the British Isles, as people are being forced off the land into the new factory towns, into atrocious conditions in the towns, and some of them are fleeing really and heading across the Atlantic and looking for land, looking for some alternative to a situation that has become, for many ordinary people, exceedingly bleak in the British Isles.
Right. Yeah.
Hi, Cole.
Thank you.
I have a question. I noticed in your maps that in your presentation, you didn't say anything about the treaties. And I wondered if Indigenous people across the prairies took up land or were able to take up land under the various homestead programs.
I'm not an expert on the treaties, but I mean, the treaties, as far as I am not a treaty expert, but my strong sense of the treaties is that from the perspective of government, they were a very simple way of acquiring a lot of land with a relative minimum of fuss cheaply. And in return for a small allocation of land and some presents, one acquired title to large tracts of apparently unfettered title to large tracts of land. That was, I think, the government's interpretation of the treaties. From the perspective of Indigenous people, they were sort of sacred understandings between two governments about rights and territory, and they saw them as far more crucial, far more central, and so the government is, the government, as soon as land is wanted in the West, the government expands the treaty arrangements. And so the early treaties in Ontario, the Robinson treaties, become the later treaties on the plains that end up, go to Treaty 11, Treaty 12 eventually, Treaty 8 in northern British Columbia, Treaty 9 in northern Saskatchewan and Alberta. Whenever the land is wanted, the government is negotiating treaties. And if you go back to the first of them, which is the Royal Proclamation of 1763, again, I mean, there's a huge literature around the Royal Proclamation, which again is not never been my main focus. But from the vantage point of the British government, the Royal Proclamation was a very convenient thing to do. It guaranteed that negotiations with Indigenous people through a large swath of the interior would have to be with the British government. It excluded other people. It kept the settlers who were coming in off the eastern seaboard away, or at least it was intended to. And because there were no other bidders for land, it made it relatively cheap. But I don't think the government had ever any intention that it would turn over these lands ad infinitum to Indigenous peoples. So the treaties become sites that are interpreted in vastly different ways, depending on whether you start with the government or you start with Indigenous peoples. I don't know whether I'm answering your question quite.
So, Dr. Harris, I have a question. Did you manage to visit the Monkman exhibition at MOA, at the Museum of Anthropology, while it was there?
I didn't, no.
Oh, so you can't really sort of expand on telling us how accurate it would be.
No, I can't. I've read a bit about it, but I didn't go there. I've really been sort of battened down, I must say. I mean, this constitutes about as much outing as I've had for a long time, and I'm still battened down. And no, I'm sorry, I haven't.
Oh, well, thank you.
But you found it fascinating, did you?
I did, and somewhat of an eye-opener that, all these things happened. I'm a settler myself, so only here for 40 years. So all of this some of the information was very new and disturbing.
Well, we're all settlers, of course. We're all settlers. And one of the things that does give me pause is the tendency, the widespread tendency to blame others for what's going on. It's very easy to, turn to the government and say, well, the government has done this or done that. And really it's the villain in the piece. In British Columbia, Governor Douglas granted quite generous reserves, and when he left in 1864, his successor, Joseph Trutch, pulled them right back to they were much narrower, much more parsimonious reserves. And so Trutch takes a shower of blame. And he isn't a very attractive person, all right, but he represented the values and aspirations of settler society through and through. The overwhelming majority of British Columbians would have agreed with Joseph Trutch. And even today, I mean, we live off the avails of settler colonialism. We live comfortably within native space. We have our own properties. We move around through this territory. We're comfortable here, but we're all if we go to the very stark basis of it, we're all interlopers. We're all outsiders. And from a native point of view, if you want to be most severe about it, we're all part of the problem. And the cities and the new landscape, the whole new geography of life that we've created in this place impinges on native ways. I'm not suggesting that we go. If we left, other people would come in and the situation would not be improved. But I am suggesting that this is an enormously complex problem, that it's built into the very fiber of what we are as a country. There are no simple solutions to it, and it is too simple just to assume that we can find quick solutions to it, which we're not going to find, and too simple to point blame at others and to ignore the fact that we're all complicit in it. We're all caught up with this, and in one way or another, although I'm not sure that what the entailments of this observation are, but we share the responsibility. I grew up in Vancouver, and when I was a kid, growing up in Kerrisdale, I had no sense that British Columbia was a native place at all. I lived within an immigrant society that was quite comfortable with itself. Then it was overwhelmingly of British background, at least in the west side of Vancouver it was. And that's what life was. The one connection with Indigenous British Columbia was a Musqueam woman who would come every 2 or 3 years to our house looking for used clothing to trade for baskets. And my mother would always save clothing and there was some exchange. I remember that. But that was, other than that, I had absolutely no sense as a kid growing up in Vancouver that this was Indigenous space, that this was a native world, and that I was, in a sense, an interloper in it. It's only when some years later I had a chair in Canadian Studies at UBC, and the quid pro quo was a book and some lectures, and so I wrote a book on the reserve system in British Columbia, making native space, and trying to explain how it was that native people end up with 1/3 of 1% of the land of British Columbia. And what that book did was draw me into the Indigenous side of British Columbia. Since writing that, I began to understand that where I am, that this place is where it's rooted. Its roots are clearly Indigenous. But just how now one responds to this, it's not simple. It's not simple.
Can I ask a question? Can I have a question? I'm just wondering, the Canadian government pays the Indians to stay on the reserves. If they leave the reserves, they do not get money, I understand, from the federal government. So it is, I think that is creating a problem. Why are we paying these people to stay on the reserve?
Oh, that's not.
I'm not sure. Again, you've got me on. I don't work on a contemporary Canada, and I'm not sure of all these details. The reserves don't make much sense in any economic way. They're tiny. They were allocated in such a way as not to exclude from non-native control any land that seemed worth anything. And so there's no agricultural value to most reserved lands. There's no timber on most reserved lands. Some of them have had some slight fishing opportunities, but there's just dots if they are. So you're right. I mean, paying people to stay on reserves doesn't make any sense at all. Because you can't make a living on a reserve.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Harris. Henrietta, are you going to?
Yeah, I am. I was remiss, of course, in the beginning regarding the acknowledgement that we live, work, and play on unceded and traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. But I would also like to thank Dr. Harris very much for his very interesting presentation, and look forward to hearing from you again on the 10th of February. Thank you so very much, Dr. Cole Harris, for being with us today.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure. I've rather rambled. I'll try and be a bit less. Try and be a little less rambling in 2 weeks.
We love rambling. We
Great.
We
Anyway,
loved
thank
it.
you very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you very much, sir.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
We enjoyed that very much. Thank you.
We look forward to the 10th of February.
Thank you. Thank you.